The blood trickled down Abigail Montgomery's face as her father's ring caught her cheekbone, the pain barely registering through the haze of betrayal and fear that consumed her. It was 1878 in Deer Lodge, Montana, and the word of a father was law, a law that Abigail had dared to challenge for the first time in her 19 years. You will marry Silas Crawford, and that is final. Judge Franklin Montgomery roared, his face crimson with rage as he towered over his daughter sprawled on the parlor floor. He's offered a generous price for you, and the merger with his railroad interests will secure our family's position in this territory for generations to come. Abigail's chest heaved as she struggled to rise. The elegant blue dress her father had insisted she wear now torn at the shoulder and stained with her own blood. Her honey blonde hair had come loose from its pins, falling in waves around her face as she forced herself to look up at him. I will not be sold like cattle, she whispered, her voice strengthening despite the throbbing pain in her face. Mother would never have allowed this. The mention of his late wife only further enraged Judge Montgomery. Your mother is gone, and you will do as I say. Silas will be here tomorrow to finalize the arrangements. I suggest you make peace with your situation. He adjusted his waistcoat with trembling hands, suddenly aware of what he had done. The violence had come so easily to him now, just as it had in the months since Alina Montgomery's death from consumption. The whiskey had become his constant companion, and with it, a cruelty Abigail barely recognized. Clean yourself up, he muttered, turning away. And stay in your room until you can behave as befits your station. The door slammed behind him, leaving Abigail alone in the lavish parlor that had once been filled with her mother's laughter. Now it felt like a prison, every expensive furnishing purchased with the profits of her father's questionable dealings as both judge and landowner in Deer Lodge. Abigail pulled herself to her feet, clutching the back of a velvet upholstered chair for support. Her reflection in the ornate mirror across the room showed the damage a cut along her cheekbone that would surely bruise, her swollen lip, and eyes that no longer held the innocence they once did. This was not the first time her father's hand had struck her since her mother's passing 6 months ago, but it was the most violent. Each instance had coincided with his increasing desperation to secure his business dealings with Silas Crawford, a man 30 years her senior with a reputation for cruelty that rivaled even her father's recent transformation. She knew what happened to Crawford's previous wives. The whispers among the servants and townsfolk told stories of bruises hidden beneath high collars and sleeves, of a woman who had fallen down the stairs at his estate in Helena. No one asked questions when powerful men were involved. With shaking hands, Abigail made her way to the stairs, intent on reaching her bedroom before any of the servants saw her in such a state. She had almost made it when Mrs. Hendricks, their housekeeper since Abigail was a child, emerged from the kitchen. Oh, Miss Abigail. The older woman's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in horror. What has he done now? It's nothing, Mrs. Hendricks, Abigail said automatically, the lie bitter on her tongue. The housekeeper's weathered face hardened as she approached, gently taking Abigail's arm. This is not nothing, child. Come, let me help you clean up. In the privacy of her bedroom, as Mrs. Hendricks tenderly dabbed at her wounds with a cloth soaked in witch hazel, Abigail made her decision. I cannot marry Mr. Crawford, she said quietly. I would rather die, Mrs. Hendricks paused, her kind eyes filled with understanding. There are worse things than death, Miss Abigail, and I fear both would await you in that man's house. She hesitated, then added in a whisper, My sister's girl ran away rather than face such a fate. She found work in a town where no one knew her name. Where would I go? How would I live? Abigail had never been permitted to learn any practical skills beyond those considered appropriate for a judge's daughter, playing the piano, embroidery, making polite conversation. Her father had forbidden her from even helping in the kitchen, insisting it was beneath her station. I don't know, child, Mrs. Hendricks admitted, but I do know that God doesn't mean for young women to be beaten and traded like property. That night, Abigail could not sleep. Her face throbbed and her mind raced with desperate plans. She had less than 24 hours before Silas Crawford would arrive to claim her. Her father had taken to locking her bedroom door from the outside at night, a precaution that had begun after she had once threatened to run away during a previous argument about Crawford. As the first light of dawn crept through her curtains, Abigail heard the sound of horses in the street below. Curious, she moved to her window and peered out, careful not to be seen. A small herd of cattle was being driven through the main street of Deer Lodge, guided by 3 men on horseback. Her attention was drawn to the lead rider, a tall man with broad shoulders, his face partially obscured by the wide brim of his hat. There was something in his posture, in the confident way he handled his mount, that spoke of freedom, something Abigail craved more than anything else in that moment. As if sensing her gaze, the rider looked up toward her window. Though she couldn't clearly see his features, the brief connection sent an inexplicable shiver through her. The moment passed as quickly as it had come, the cattle and their handlers moving on toward the edge of town. Abigail remained by the window, watching until they disappeared from view, taking with them a strange sense of possibility that she couldn't quite name. A knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. The lock turned and Mrs. Hendricks entered with a breakfast tray, her expression grim. "Your father has gone to the courthouse early," she said quietly. "He left instructions that you are to remain in your room until he returns with Mr. Crawford this afternoon." Abigail felt the blood drain from her face. "So soon? I thought I would have until tomorrow." "Mr. Crawford sent word last night that he would arrive earlier than planned." Mrs. Hendricks set down the tray and moved closer, lowering her voice. "Miss Abigail, I have something for you." From her apron pocket, the housekeeper withdrew a small leather pouch. "It isn't much, just my savings from the past 2 years, but it might help if you were to decide that staying here isn't safe for you anymore." Tears filled Abigail's eyes as she took the pouch, feeling the weight of the coins inside. "Mrs. Hendricks, I can't take this." "You can and you will," the older woman insisted, clasping Abigail's hands around the pouch. "I've watched you grow from a babe in your mother's arms. I promised her I would look after you, and I've failed in that these past months." Her voice broke slightly. "I should have done something sooner when he first raised his hand to you." "It's not your fault," Abigail whispered. "He would have dismissed you, and then who would have been here to help me?" Mrs. Hendricks straightened, wiping at her eyes. "Eat your breakfast, keep up your strength. And if an opportunity presents itself." She didn't finish the sentence, but the meaning was clear. After the housekeeper left, Abigail forced herself to eat despite her churning stomach. She needed to think clearly, to plan. The money from Mrs. Hendricks would help, but how would she get out of the house? And where would she go? The nearest town was miles away, and she had never traveled alone. As she pondered her limited options, she heard commotion from downstairs voices, then the sound of the front door opening. Fear gripped her as she thought Silas Crawford might have arrived even earlier than expected, but then she recognized her father's angry tone. "This is outrageous. Those cattle damaged property all along Main Street. As judge of this county, I demand compensation." A deeper voice responded, too low for Abigail to make out the words. Curious, she moved to her door, pressing her ear against it to hear better. "I don't care if it was an accident," her father continued. "Your carelessness has consequences, Mr. Thornton, Daniel Thornton." The voice was clearer now, steady, with a hint of a southern drawl. "And with all due respect, Judge Montgomery, your shopkeepers built their displays too close to a known cattle route. My men and I did our best to keep the herd contained." Abigail's heart skipped. It was the cowboy she had seen from her window. It had to be. There was a quality to his voice that matched the confidence she had observed in his bearing. "Well, Mr. Thornton," her father was saying, his tone shifting to one Abigail recognized as dangerously controlled, "perhaps we can come to an arrangement. The damages could be overlooked for the right price." There was a pause before the cowboy responded. "I'm a fair man, Judge. If there are legitimate damages, I'll pay what's owed, no more, no less. I'd be happy to speak with each business owner directly to assess the situation." Something in his tone suggested he understood exactly what her father was implying, and was deliberately refusing to participate in any scheme. Abigail found herself smiling despite her circumstances. Few people stood up to Judge Montgomery. "That won't be necessary," her father said coldly. "I'll have my clerk prepare a bill for the total damages. You can settle it before you leave town." "I'll need itemized receipts," came the calm reply, "for my records." The conversation continued, growing more heated as her father's attempts to intimidate the cowboy were met with polite but unmovable resistance. Abigail listened, fascinated by anyone who could stand their ground against her father without resorting to his tactics. Eventually, she heard the front door close, followed by her father's heavy footsteps ascending the stairs. She scrambled back from the door just as the lock turned, and he entered without knocking. "You're to make yourself presentable," he announced without preamble, his eyes narrowing at the sight of her bruised face. "Mr. Crawford will be here at 2 o'clock. Wear the green dress, it has the high collar that will cover." He gestured vaguely toward her face. "Yes, father," Abigail said quietly, lowering her eyes in a show of submission she did not feel. He seemed satisfied with her apparent compliance. "Good, perhaps you've finally come to your senses." He turned to leave, then paused. "And Abigail, do not disappoint me today. The consequences would be severe." The threat hung in the air as he left, locking the door behind him once again. Abigail stood frozen for several moments, the reality of her situation crashing over her anew. In just a few hours, her fate would be sealed unless she found a way out. She moved to her window again, looking down at the street below as if it might offer some solution. The town was coming to life, shopkeepers opening their doors, women with baskets heading to market, a couple of children chasing each other down the boardwalk. Normal, everyday life continuing while hers was about to end. And then she saw him again, the cowboy, Daniel Thornton, emerging from the general store across the street. In the clear light of day, she could finally see him properly. He was tall and broad-shouldered as she had thought, with dark hair visible beneath his hat and a strong, featured face that looked to be in its late 20s. He moved with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin, stopping to help an elderly woman who had dropped her parcels. As he handed the last package back to the woman, who smiled gratefully up at him, Daniel Thornton glanced up toward Abigail's window. This time, she was sure he saw her. Their eyes met briefly before she stepped back, her heart racing inexplicably. An idea began to form in her mind, wild, desperate, and possibly her only chance. Moving quickly, Abigail went to her writing desk and took out a sheet of paper. She hesitated only briefly before penning a note in her neat, careful handwriting. "Sir, I am being held against my will and am in grave danger. I am to be forced into marriage with a man known for cruelty. Please, if you have any compassion, be beneath my window at midnight. I will attempt to escape. A.M." She folded the note carefully, then looked around her room for something to weight it with. Her eyes fell on her mother's silver hairpin, one of the few keepsakes she had managed to hide from her father when he had sold most of her mother's jewelry to cover gambling debts. Securing the note with the hairpin, Abigail returned to the window and watched, waiting for Daniel Thornton to reappear. Minutes stretched endlessly until finally, he emerged from another shop further down the street, leading his horse by the reins. Heart pounding, Abigail took careful aim and dropped the weighted note, watching as it fluttered down to land almost directly in the cowboy's path. He stopped, looking down with a puzzled expression, then glanced around before bending to retrieve it. Abigail drew back from the window, not daring to watch as he read it. She had taken an enormous risk. If he showed the note to her father, her situation would become immeasurably worse. But something in the way he had stood his ground against her father gave her hope that he might help, or at least not make things worse. The rest of the day passed in a haze of dread and desperate planning. Mrs. Hendricks helped her dress in the green gown as instructed, arranging her hair to further obscure the bruising on her face. Neither spoke of Abigail's plan. It was safer for the housekeeper not to know the details. At precisely 2 o'clock, Abigail heard the sound of carriage wheels on the gravel drive. From her window, she saw Silas Crawford descend, a portly man with thinning hair and cold eyes, dressed in an expensive suit that did little to disguise his corpulent frame. He carried a small box that undoubtedly contained an engagement ring. Moments later, her father unlocked her door. "He's here," he said unnecessarily. "Remember what I said, Abigail?" She followed him downstairs, each step feeling like she was walking to her execution. In the parlor, Silas Crawford rose from his seat, his small eyes traveling over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Miss Montgomery," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "how lovely you look today. Your father tells me you've agreed to our arrangement." Abigail felt her father's warning gaze boring into her. She forced herself to curtsy slightly. "Mr. Crawford," she acknowledged, unable to bring herself to confirm or deny his statement. "Splendid," Crawford continued, seemingly untroubled by her lack of enthusiasm. "I've brought something for you." He opened the small box to reveal a diamond ring, ostentatious and cold like the man himself. "Isn't it beautiful, Abigail?" her father prompted when she remained silent. "It's very grand," she managed, fighting the urge to run as Crawford took her hand and slid the ring onto her finger. It felt heavy like a shackle. "We shall be married in 2 weeks' time," Crawford announced. "I've already spoken with the minister. Your father has generously agreed to let you bring one servant to my home in Helena. I suggested the older woman who answered the door. She seems competent." Abigail's eyes darted to her father in surprise. He had never mentioned that Mrs. Hendricks would accompany her. "Yes, Mrs. Hendricks has been with our family for many years," her father said smoothly. "She will help Abigail adjust to her new household duties." She understood then this small concession was meant to placate her, to ensure her cooperation. Her father knew how much she valued the housekeeper's presence. But even having Mrs. Hendricks with her wouldn't make a marriage to Silas Crawford bearable. The afternoon dragged on endlessly, with Crawford speaking at length about his business interests and properties, while Abigail sat in silence, nodding occasionally when it seemed expected. Her father plied Crawford with whiskey, becoming increasingly jovial as the afternoon wore on, while Crawford remained coldly sober, his calculating eyes rarely leaving Abigail. When Crawford finally took his leave, promising to call again the following day, Abigail felt as though she could breathe for the first time in hours. The moment the door closed behind him, she began to remove the ring. "Leave it," her father snapped, his false good humor evaporating instantly. "You are engaged now. The ring stays on your finger." "Father, please," Abigail began, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Not another word. Go to your room. I have business to attend to in town, but I will lock you in for the night when I return. Perhaps a night to reflect on your good fortune will improve your attitude." Abigail retreated upstairs, her mind racing. Her father's planned absence was an unexpected stroke of luck. It might give her the opportunity she needed to prepare for her escape attempt. Once in her room, she moved quickly, gathering only what she would need. A change of clothes, the money Mrs. Hendricks had given her, a small daguerreotype of her mother, and a few other essentials that would fit in a small satchel. She changed out of the green dress into a simpler brown one that wouldn't attract attention, hiding the satchel under her bed. All that remained was to wait for her father to leave again, for night to fall, and to see if Daniel Thornton would appear beneath her window as she had requested. The hours crept by with excruciating slowness. Her father returned briefly to check on her, locking her door as promised before departing again, mentioning that he would be at his club until late. Abigail pressed her ear to the door, listening as his footsteps receded, then the sound of the front door closing. Darkness fell over Deer Lodge, the sounds of the town gradually quieting as businesses closed and families gathered for evening meals. From her window, Abigail could see lamps being lit in windows across the street, the occasional figure passing by on the boardwalk. She strained her eyes looking for any sign of Daniel Thornton, but the shadows beneath her window remained empty. As the church bell tolled 10, then 11, doubt began to creep in. Perhaps he had dismissed her note as a prank or worse, shown it to her father. Perhaps he had simply left town, continuing on his way with his cattle and men, the house grew quiet as the servants retired for the night. Abigail had not seen Mrs. Hendricks since dinner. Her father had insisted on serving her himself, standing over her as she ate to ensure she didn't speak with the housekeeper. Finally, the church bell tolled midnight. Abigail, who had been sitting by her window for the past hour, peered anxiously into the darkness below. At first she saw nothing, and her heart sank. Then, a movement caught her eye, a shadow separating itself from the deeper darkness of an alleyway across the street. Daniel Thornton stepped into view, looking cautiously up and down the street before moving to stand directly beneath her window. He was dressed much as he had been earlier, though he had exchanged his hat for a bandana tied around his head, making him less recognizable in the dim light. Abigail's heart leaped. He had come. Now she faced the challenge of getting out of her locked room and down to him without alerting anyone. She had prepared for this, having discovered years ago that the ornate molding around her door concealed a design flaw if she used something thin enough. She could manipulate the simple lock mechanism from her side. In the past, she had used this knowledge only to sneak down to the kitchen for extra desserts or to retrieve books from her father's library when he was away. Tonight, it would be her path to freedom. Using a thin letter opener, Abigail carefully worked at the lock, sighing in relief when she heard the telltale click. She eased the door open, wincing at a slight creak, then froze, listening for any sound that might indicate someone had heard. The house remained silent. Gathering her courage, Abigail retrieved her satchel from under the bed and slipped out of her room, closing the door behind her to maintain the appearance that she was still locked inside. She crept down the hallway, avoiding the spots she knew would creak, and made her way down the back stairs that the servants used. The kitchen was dark and empty, moonlight streaming through the windows providing just enough illumination for her to find her way to the back door. This would be the riskiest part. The door had a heavy iron bolt that made considerable noise when moved. Abigail took a deep breath, then slid it back as slowly as she could, grimacing at the metallic scrape that seemed deafening in the quiet house. Again, she paused, listening. Nothing. With trembling hands, she opened the door just enough to slip through, then closed it quietly behind her. The night air was cool against her face as she made her way around the side of the house, keeping to the shadows of the garden. When she reached the front, she peered cautiously around the corner. Daniel Thornton still stood beneath her window, looking increasingly concerned as he glanced between the window and the street, clearly wondering if she would appear. Abigail stepped out from the shadows, catching his attention with a small wave. His expression showed momentary surprise before he quickly crossed to meet her, moving with remarkable stealth for such a large man. "Miss Montgomery," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. Abigail nodded, suddenly aware of how wild this all must seem to him, a strange woman begging for rescue in the middle of the night. "I'm sorry to involve you in this, Mr. Thornton, but I had no one else to turn to." His eyes moved over her face, narrowing as they registered the bruising that was still visible despite her attempts to conceal it. "Your note said you're in danger. From your father?" "Yes," she admitted, the single word carrying the weight of months of fear and pain. "And from the man he's forcing me to marry tomorrow. Please, there isn't much time. My father could return at any moment." Daniel nodded once, decision made. "I have horses waiting at the edge of town. Can you ride?" "Yes, though it's been some time," Abigail said, relief washing over her at his immediate willingness to help. "Stay close and keep quiet," he instructed, guiding her toward the shadows of the trees that lined the street. They moved swiftly but carefully, avoiding the pools of lamplight, taking side streets and alleys rather than the main road. Every sound made Abigail jump, a dog barking in the distance, the laughter of late revelers from the saloon, the distant rumble of a wagon. But Daniel's steady presence beside her kept her moving forward, his hand occasionally touching her elbow to guide her direction. At the edge of town, as promised, 2 horses waited, tethered to a tree just off the road. One was the chestnut stallion she had seen him riding earlier, the other was a smaller bay mare. "My camp is about 5 miles outside town," Daniel explained as he helped her mount the mare. "My men are there with the cattle. We'll be safe for tonight, and tomorrow we can decide where you want to go." Abigail settled into the saddle, adjusting her skirts as best she could. The reality of what she was doing suddenly hit her. She was running away in the middle of the night with a man she barely knew, leaving behind everything familiar, however painful it had become. Daniel seemed to sense her moment of doubt. He paused before mounting his own horse, looking up at her with serious eyes that appeared almost silver in the moonlight. "Miss Montgomery, I give you my word that you'll come to no harm with me. If you've changed your mind, I can take you back right now, and no one need know you tried to leave." The sincerity in his voice steadied her. Whatever lay ahead, it couldn't be worse than what awaited her at home. "No," she said firmly. "I haven't changed my mind, and please call me Abigail." A small smile touched his lips as he swung up into his saddle with practiced ease. "Abigail, then." "And I'm Daniel." They set off at a steady trot, keeping to the grass alongside the road to muffle the sound of hooves. As they crested a small rise, Abigail couldn't resist looking back at the town that had been her home for all her 19 years. From this distance, Deer Lodge looked peaceful, its buildings silvered by moonlight, smoke curling lazily from a few chimneys. No one would guess the secrets and pain hidden behind the respectable facades of its finest homes. "Are you all right?" Daniel asked quietly, bringing his horse alongside hers. Abigail turned away from the view, facing forward toward whatever uncertain future awaited her. "Yes," she said, and was surprised to realize it was true. "I'm all right." They rode in companionable silence for several miles, the only sounds the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves and the night creatures calling to one another from the surrounding wilderness. The moon provided enough light to see the trail, and Daniel seemed to know the way instinctively, guiding them through stands of pine trees and across small streams. Finally, they approached a clearing where the glow of a campfire could be seen. Daniel raised his hand in a gesture Abigail didn't understand, then whistled a distinctive pattern. A moment later, an answering whistle came from near the fire. "Just letting my men know it's me," he explained. "We've had trouble with rustlers in these parts." As they rode into the clearing, Abigail saw two men rise from beside the fire, their expressions curious as they noted her presence. A small herd of cattle was visible at the far edge of the clearing, most lying down for the night with a few still grazing in the moonlight. "Boys, this is Miss Abigail Montgomery," Daniel said as he dismounted, then moved to help her down from her horse. "She'll be traveling with us for a while." The men nodded respectfully, though Abigail could see the questions in their eyes. One was older, perhaps in his 50s, with a weathered face and graying hair. The other was younger, closer to Daniel's age, with a friendly, open countenance. "Miss Montgomery, this is Jim Hollister," Daniel indicated the older man, "and Mike Cooper. They're the best cowhands in Montana territory, though don't tell them I said so." Jim tipped his hat while Mike gave her a warm smile. "Pleasure to meet you, madam," Jim said. "Can I get you some coffee? It's strong enough to float a horseshoe, but it'll warm you up." "Thank you," Abigail said, suddenly realizing how cold she had become during the ride. "That would be very kind." Daniel led her to a log near the fire, draping a blanket around her shoulders before taking the horses to where several others were picketed at the edge of the camp. Jim handed her a tin cup of steaming coffee, which she accepted gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around it. As she sipped the strong, bitter brew, Abigail became aware of how strange this all was, sitting by a campfire in the wilderness, surrounded by men she had just met, having fled her home with little more than the clothes on her back. Yet somehow she felt safer than she had in months. Daniel returned and settled beside her on the log, accepting his own cup of coffee from Jim. "The boys and I were driving these cattle to my ranch near Virginia City," he explained. "We're about halfway there. It's another 3 days' ride, assuming good weather." Abigail nodded, unsure what this meant for her. "I don't want to interfere with your plans," she said hesitantly. "Perhaps you could take me to the nearest town with a stagecoach station." Daniel studied her over the rim of his cup. "If that's what you want." But you should know your father's influence extends throughout this territory. Once he discovers you're gone, he'll send men looking for you." The thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the night air. "You're right," she admitted, "but I don't know where else to go. I have some money, but not enough to travel far." "Come with us to Virginia City," Daniel suggested. "It's a good-sized town, far enough from Deer Lodge that you could start fresh. I have connections there who could help you find respectable work and lodging." The offer was tempting, but Abigail hesitated. "Why are you helping me? You don't even know me." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "I had a sister once," he finally said, his voice low. "Her name was Sarah. She was married off to a man very much like the one you described in your note. He beat her regularly, and when I tried to intervene, my father, who had arranged the marriage, forbade me from interfering." His jaw tightened. "She died 6 months later. The official cause was a fall down the stairs, but I knew better." "I'm so sorry," Abigail whispered, understanding now why he had responded to her plea for help. "After that, I left home, came west, started over," he continued. "I promised myself I'd never stand by again if I saw someone in a similar situation." He looked at her directly, his expression solemn. "When I read your note and then saw your face today, I couldn't ignore it." Impulsively, Abigail reached out and touched his hand. "Thank you." "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come," he nodded, seeming slightly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "You should get some rest. We'll head out at first light." Jim had already prepared a small shelter for her, a canvas tarp stretched between 2 trees with blankets spread beneath it. It was a far cry from her feather bed at home, but to Abigail it looked like the most welcoming sight imaginable. As she settled in for what remained of the night, listening to the soft lowing of cattle and the occasional crackle of the fire, Abigail felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since before her mother's death. She was free, uncertain of her future, but free from her father's cruelty and Silas Crawford's cold eyes. Her last thought before drifting to sleep was of Daniel's face in the firelight, the compassion in his eyes when he spoke of his sister, and the surprising gentleness of his calloused hand as he had helped her from her horse. Dawn came too quickly, the first light of day filtering through the canvas above her. Abigail woke to the sounds of the camp, already active men talking in low voices, horses nickering, the clatter of cooking utensils. She emerged from her makeshift shelter to find Mike tending a fire over which a large pot of something aromatic bubbled. He grinned when he saw her. "Morning, Miss Montgomery. Hope you slept well. Breakfast's almost ready, just some beans and bacon, nothing fancy." "It smells wonderful," she assured him, realizing she was genuinely hungry despite the circumstances. Daniel and Jim were some distance away, examining a map spread on a flat rock. They looked up as she approached, Daniel straightening to his full height. "Good morning," he said, his eyes assessing her with concern. "How are you feeling?" In the clear light of day, Abigail knew her bruises must be more visible than they had been in the firelight. Self-consciously, she raised a hand to her cheek. "I'm well, thank you." "Better than I have been in some time." Jim discreetly moved away, giving them privacy as Daniel continued to study her. "We should leave soon," he said. "Your father will have discovered your absence by now." The thought sent a wave of anxiety through her. "He'll be furious," she murmured, more to herself than to Daniel. "He won't find you," Daniel promised, his voice low and firm. "I won't let him." There was such conviction in his tone that Abigail found herself believing him, despite knowing how powerful and persistent her father could be when crossed. After a hasty but filling breakfast, they broke camp efficiently, the men working together with the practiced ease of those who had done this many times before. Abigail tried to help, but soon realized she was more in the way than anything else, her city upbringing having left her ill prepared for the realities of life on the trail. "Don't worry about it," Daniel said when she apologized. "You'll learn what needs doing as we go." They were ready to move out within an hour, the cattle gathered and pointed in the right direction, the campsite cleared of any evidence of their stay. Daniel helped Abigail mount the bay mare again, showing her how to secure her satchel to the saddle. "It'll be a long day's ride." he warned. "We'll need to push harder than usual to make up for lost time." Abigail nodded, determined not to slow them down. "I can manage." The day passed in a blur of dust, movement, and new sensations. Abigail had never spent so many hours in a saddle, and by midday her body was protesting vehemently. Yet she gritted her teeth and said nothing, unwilling to be the cause of delay. Daniel rode beside her when he could, occasionally leaving to help Jim and Mike keep the cattle moving in the right direction. During these times, he would often return with wildflowers he had spotted along the way, presenting them to her with a shy smile that transformed his serious face into something unexpectedly boyish. "To brighten your day," he said the first time, holding out a small bunch of purple lupines. Abigail accepted them with genuine pleasure, tucking one behind her ear and the rest into her saddlebag to press later as keepsakes. The small gesture touched her deeply. It had been so long since anyone had done something simply to bring her joy. They stopped briefly at midday to rest the horses and allow the cattle to graze and drink from a small stream they were following. Abigail practically fell from her saddle, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Daniel was at her side immediately, his strong hands steadying her. "You're doing well," he said quietly. "Most city folk would have been complaining for hours by now." "I may not be complaining, but I certainly feel like it," she admitted with a rueful smile, rubbing her sore thighs. He chuckled, the sound warm and rich. "It gets easier. Your muscles will remember what to do." They shared a simple lunch of jerky and hardtack, washed down with water from the stream. Abigail found herself watching Daniel as he interacted with his men, noting the respect with which they treated one another. There was none of the rigid hierarchy she was accustomed to in her father's house, where servants were treated as barely more than furniture. "How long have you had your ranch?" she asked as they sat side by side on a fallen log. 5 years, Daniel replied. "Started with just 50 acres and a few dozen cattle. Now I have closer to 1,000 acres and a decent-sized herd." There was quiet pride in his voice. "It's good land, plenty of water, good grass. The house isn't much yet, but I'm adding to it when I can." "It sounds wonderful," Abigail said sincerely. He glanced at her, a question in his eyes. "It's a far cry from what you're used to, I imagine. Your father's house in Deer Lodge is one of the finest in town." "And one of the unhappiest," Abigail said softly. "I would rather have a simple home filled with kindness than a mansion filled with fear." Daniel's expression softened. "That's a wise way of looking at things." They continued their journey shortly after, pushing on through the afternoon as the landscape gradually changed, the pine forests giving way to more open country with rolling hills and scattered stands of aspen. The cattle moved steadily, seeming to sense they were heading toward home. By the time they stopped to make camp for the night, Abigail was so exhausted she could barely dismount. Daniel had to lift her from the saddle, his hands strong and sure around her waist. She swayed on her feet, and for a moment he kept his hands where they were, steadying her. "Thank you," she murmured, acutely aware of how close he was, of the clean, masculine scent of him, leather and pine, and something uniquely his own. "You're welcome," he replied, his voice slightly rougher than usual. He stepped back, clearing his throat. "You should rest. I'll bring you some food when it's ready." That night, as she lay beneath her canvas shelter listening to the night sounds of the wilderness, Abigail found herself thinking about Daniel in a way that both surprised and unsettled her. She had never given much thought to men as potential companions, having been raised with the expectation that her marriage would be arranged for social and financial advantage, not personal happiness. But there was something about Daniel Thornton that drew her: his quiet strength, his kindness, the gentle way he treated her despite his imposing physical presence. It was far too soon for such thoughts, she knew. She was still technically engaged to Silas Crawford, still legally under her father's authority, still running for her freedom. And yet, as she drifted toward sleep, it was Daniel's face she saw in her mind's eye, and the thought of his smile brought an answering warmth to her heart. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with a crispness to the air that hinted at the approaching autumn. Abigail woke feeling surprisingly refreshed despite the hardness of her bed, and the soreness that pervaded every muscle in her body. When she emerged from her shelter, she found Daniel already awake, sitting by the freshly built fire with a cup of coffee in his hands. He looked up as she approached, his eyes warming. "You look better this morning," he observed, pouring a cup of coffee for her. "Sleep well." "Better than I expected," she admitted, accepting the cup gratefully. "Though I'm not sure I'll be able to get back on that horse today," he laughed. "You will, and it won't hurt quite as much as yesterday, I promise." They ate breakfast together as Jim and Mike prepared to move the herd. The easy camaraderie between the men was something Abigail found herself envying. She had never had friends, her father having deemed most of the young women in Deer Lodge unsuitable companions for a judge's daughter. "We should reach Virginia City by tomorrow afternoon," Daniel told her as they cleaned up after the meal. "Once we're there, we can figure out what's next for you." The reminder of her uncertain future sobered Abigail. "I don't know what I'll do," she confessed. "I've never worked for wages. My father didn't believe women should be employed outside the home." Daniel considered this. "What skills do you have, besides riding like a trooper after years away from the saddle?" he added with a small smile. Abigail thought about it. "I can read and write well. I know arithmetic. I play the piano and speak some French. I can sew, though not as well as a professional seamstress." She paused, then added with a self-deprecating laugh, "None of which seems particularly useful in the real world." "You'd be surprised," Daniel said thoughtfully. "Virginia City has a school that's always looking for teachers. Reading, writing, and arithmetic are exactly what they need, and I know the schoolmistress, Miss Winters. She's a good woman, fair-minded. I could introduce you." Hope flickered in Abigail's chest. "Do you think she would consider me without references? I couldn't exactly ask my father for a letter of recommendation." "Let me worry about that," Daniel said confidently. "Miss Winters trusts my judgment, and once she meets you, I'm sure she'll see what I see." "What do you see?" Abigail asked before she could stop herself. Daniel's eyes met hers, serious and intent. Someone brave enough to leave everything behind rather than surrender to a life of misery. Someone smart enough to find a way out. Someone kind enough to thank the cook for beans and bacon as if it were a feast at the governor's mansion. His mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Mike is still talking about that, by the way." Abigail felt her cheeks warm at his assessment. "You give me too much credit." "I don't think so," he said quietly. Then, seeming to sense her discomfort with the direction of the conversation, he stood and offered his hand. "Come on, time to face that horse again." True to his word, the day's ride was marginally less painful than the previous one had been. Abigail found herself able to appreciate the stunning scenery. They passed through vast meadows carpeted with late summer wildflowers, rugged mountains in the distance, crystal clear streams teeming with fish. It was a wilder, more beautiful world than she had imagined existed beyond the confines of Deer Lodge. Around midday, as they paused to water the horses and cattle at a particularly lovely spot where a stream widened into a small pool, Daniel dismounted and helped Abigail down. She winced as her feet touched the ground, her thigh muscles protesting after hours in the saddle. "Walk around a bit," Daniel suggested. "It'll help with the stiffness." She did as he advised, moving slowly along the edge of the pool. The water was clear enough that she could see small fish darting among the rocks, and dragonflies hovered above the surface, their wings glinting in the sunlight. "It's beautiful here," she said when Daniel joined her, having seen to the horses. "This is my favorite spot on the trail," he admitted. "I always try to stop here when I can." He hesitated, then added, "I thought you might like to see it." The idea that he had planned this stop specifically for her pleasure touched Abigail deeply. "Thank you for showing me." They stood in companionable silence for a few moments, watching the play of light on the water. Then Daniel cleared his throat. "Abigail, there's something I need to ask you," he said, his tone serious, "about your father." She tensed slightly but nodded for him to continue. "Do you think he'll come after you himself or send others?" It was a question she had been avoiding in her own mind, but one that needed answering. "He'll send others first," she said after careful consideration. "The sheriff, probably, and some of his men. He wouldn't want to appear desperate by searching himself." She paused, then added reluctantly, "But if they don't find me quickly, he might come." His pride wouldn't allow him to lose. Daniel nodded, his expression grim. "That's what I figured. We need to be prepared for that possibility." "What will we do if he finds us?" Abigail couldn't keep the fear from her voice. "He won't take you back," Daniel said firmly. "I promise you that, but I'd prefer to avoid a confrontation if possible. Once we reach Virginia City, we'll need to be careful until we can establish you there properly." "I don't want to bring trouble to your doorstep," Abigail said, distressed at the thought of putting Daniel and his men at risk. He smiled slightly. "Trouble has a way of finding me regardless. Besides," he added, his voice softening, "some things are worth the risk." The look in his eyes as he said this made Abigail's heart beat faster. Before she could respond, however, Jim called from across the clearing. "Daniel, riders coming from the east." Daniel's expression immediately shifted to alert wariness. "Stay here," he told Abigail, moving quickly to where his horse was tethered. He took his rifle from its scabbard before striding to join Jim at the edge of the trees. Abigail watched anxiously as both men peered down the trail they had just traveled. After a moment, Daniel relaxed slightly, lowering his rifle. "It's just a family in a wagon," he called back to her. "Nothing to worry about." Relief flooded through her, but the incident served as a stark reminder of the danger they were in. Her father would not give up easily, and Silas Crawford, having been publicly humiliated by her disappearance, would be equally determined to find her. They continued their journey shortly after, pushing the cattle at a slightly faster pace now that they were in more open country. By the time they made camp that evening, they had covered more ground than Daniel had initially expected. "We'll reach Virginia City by noon tomorrow," he told Abigail as they sat by the fire after dinner. Jim and Mike had already retired to their bedrolls, leaving them alone in the circle of firelight. "What will happen then?" Abigail asked, unable to keep the anxiety from her voice. Daniel studied her face for a moment before responding. "That depends on what you want, Abigail. What I want." The question took her by surprise. So few people in her life had ever asked what she wanted. "Yes," he said simply. "This is your life we're talking about. What do you want for your future?" Abigail looked into the flames, considering. "I want to be safe," she said finally. "I want to work and support myself. I want to never again be at the mercy of someone who would hurt me." She paused, then added in a softer voice, "I want to someday have a home of my own, filled with kindness instead of fear." Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Those are good wants." "Achievable ones. What about you?" she asked, curious. "What do you want for your future?" He smiled slightly. "Some of the same things, to build my ranch into something I can be proud of, to someday have a family to share it with." His eyes met hers across the fire. "To create a home where kindness rules." The similarity of their desires hung in the air between them, unspoken but acknowledged. Abigail felt a connection to this man that defied the shortness of their acquaintance, as if she had known him far longer than the mere days since he had rescued her from her father's house. "Thank you," she said suddenly, needing to express the gratitude that welled up within her. "For everything. For answering my note, for taking me away, for treating me with such consideration. I know you had no obligation to help me." "I couldn't have done anything else," he said simply. They sat in silence for a while longer until the fire began to die down. Then Daniel stood, stretching his tall frame. "We should get some rest. Tomorrow will be a busy day." Abigail nodded, rising as well. She hesitated, then impulsively stepped forward and placed a gentle kiss on his cheek. "Good night, Daniel." His eyes widened slightly in surprise, but a slow smile spread across his face. "Good night, Abigail." As she settled into her now familiar shelter, Abigail realized that for the first time since leaving Deer Lodge, she was looking forward to tomorrow rather than fearing it. Morning came with a sense of anticipation that had both exciting and anxious edges to it. Virginia City represented safety in one sense, but also a new set of challenges as Abigail would need to establish herself there, find work, create a new life from nothing. They broke camp early and set off at a brisk pace, the cattle seeming to sense they were nearing home and moving more eagerly. The landscape became increasingly familiar to Daniel, who pointed out landmarks to Abigail as they rode side by side. "That's Alder Gulch," he said, indicating a distant ravine. "Where gold was first discovered in this area, and those mountains beyond are the tobacco roots. My ranch is nestled at their feet about 5 miles outside of town." Abigail listened, trying to commit everything to memory. This would be her home now, these landmarks are new guideposts. "You'll stay at my ranch tonight," Daniel continued. "I have a housekeeper, Mrs. Larson, who lives in a small cabin on the property with her husband. She'll make sure you're comfortable. Tomorrow we can go into town and speak with Miss Winters about the teaching position." "That sounds perfect," Abigail said, grateful for his continued support. She had been privately worried about where she would stay once they reached Virginia City. Her limited funds not likely to stretch far in a mining town where accommodations were often at a premium. As they crested a rise around midday, Virginia City came into view in the valley below. It was larger than Abigail had expected, a proper town with several streets of buildings, most constructed of wood but some of brick or stone. The main street bustled with activity, wagons and riders moving about on business, shoppers entering and exiting the various establishments. "It's bigger than Deer Lodge," she remarked, surprised. Daniel nodded. "The gold rush brought people here from all over. It's calmed down some in recent years, but it's still the most important town in this part of the territory." They skirted the edge of town, Daniel explaining that it would be easier to take the cattle directly to his ranch rather than through the busy streets. As they passed, Abigail could feel curious eyes on them, or more specifically on her. A woman in a riding skirt traveling with cattlemen was clearly an unusual sight. "People are staring," she murmured uneasily. "Let them," Daniel said firmly. "You've done nothing wrong." They continued on for another hour beyond the town, finally turning down a well-maintained road that led toward the mountains. A wooden sign marked the entrance to the property: Thornton Ranch. As they rode down the long drive, Abigail got her first glimpse of what Daniel had been building over the past 5 years. Lush pastures stretched in all directions, dotted with cattle and bordered by split-rail fences. Ahead, a substantial log house stood on a gentle rise, with several outbuildings and corrals arranged nearby. It wasn't as grand as her father's house in Deer Lodge, but it had a solid, welcoming presence that immediately appealed to her. "It's lovely," she said sincerely. Daniel looked pleased at her approval. "It's home." They were met at the main corral by several ranch hands who came to help with the cattle. Daniel introduced Abigail briefly, explaining she was a friend who would be staying for a while. If the men were curious about her presence or the bruises still visible on her face, they were too polite to show it. A plump, gray-haired woman emerged from the main house as they approached, wiping her hands on her apron. Her weathered face broke into a warm smile at the sight of Daniel. "Mr. Thornton, we weren't expecting you until tomorrow at the earliest. I haven't prepared anything special for dinner yet." "No need for anything special, Mrs. Larson," Daniel assured her as he dismounted, then moved to help Abigail from her horse. "But I've brought a guest who will be staying with us. This is Miss Abigail Montgomery. Abigail, this is Mrs. Larson, the finest housekeeper in Montana Territory. Mrs. Larson's kind eyes took in Abigail's appearance, the bruised face, the simple brown dress now dusty and wrinkled from days on the trail, the single small satchel that contained all her worldly possessions. But there was no judgment in her gaze, only compassion. "Miss Montgomery, you're most welcome," she said warmly. "I'll have a room ready for you in no time, and I imagine you'd like a hot bath after your journey." Tears sprang unexpectedly to Abigail's eyes at the simple kindness. "Yes, please," she managed. "That would be wonderful, Mrs. Larson nodded, already bustling toward the house. "I'll see to it right away. Mr. Thornton, will you show Miss Montgomery to the parlor? I've kept a fire going despite the warm day, as the evenings still get chilly." Daniel guided Abigail into the house, which proved to be as welcoming inside as out. The parlor was comfortably furnished with sturdy pieces made by skilled hands rather than the ornate, uncomfortable furniture her father had favored. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that showed signs of regular use. A large fireplace dominated another wall, a cheerful fire crackling within despite the mild weather outside. "Please, make yourself at home," Daniel said, suddenly seeming slightly awkward, as if only now realizing the intimacy of having her in his personal space. "I need to see to the cattle and speak with my foreman, but I'll join you for dinner." "Thank you," Abigail said, sinking gratefully into a comfortable armchair near the fire. "For everything." He nodded, his eyes lingering on her face for a moment before he turned and left. Mrs. Larson returned shortly after, showing Abigail to a pleasant bedroom on the second floor. The room was simply but comfortably furnished, with a large bed covered in a handmade quilt, a dresser with a mirror, a small writing desk by the window, and a rocking chair in the corner. "The bathroom is just down the hall," Mrs. Larson explained. "I've started heating water for your bath. It should be ready in about half an hour." She hesitated, then added gently, "I've put out some clean clothes on the bed. They belong to Mr. Thornton's sister who passed some years ago. He keeps a trunk of her things in the attic. I hope you don't mind." "Not at all," Abigail assured her, touched by the thoughtfulness. "Thank you." Left alone, Abigail moved to examine the clothes Mrs. Larson had provided. There was a simple blue cotton dress that looked to be about her size, a white blouse and a brown skirt, along with necessary undergarments. The items were slightly out of date in style, but of good quality and well maintained. These had been Sarah's clothes. She realized the sister Daniel had been unable to save from an abusive marriage. The parallel to her own situation was not lost on Abigail, and she felt a renewed gratitude for Daniel's intervention in her life. The promised bath was everything she had dreamed of during their days on the trail. The hot water soothed her aching muscles, and the lavender-scented soap misses Larson had provided felt like an unimaginable luxury after days of making do with cold stream water and minimal toiletries. By the time she dressed in Sarah's blue dress and made her way back downstairs, Abigail felt like a new woman. Her hair, washed and dried, hung in loose waves down her back, and though the bruises on her face were still visible, they seemed less stark now that the dust of the trail had been washed away. She found Daniel in the parlor, freshly bathed himself and dressed in clean clothes. He rose when she entered, his eyes widening slightly as he took in her appearance. "You look." He began, then seemed at a loss for words. "Better," she supplied with a small smile. "Beautiful," he said simply. The word hung between them, honest and unadorned. Abigail felt her cheeks warm, but she did not look away from his gaze. "Thank you for the loan of your sister's clothes," she said. "Mrs. Larson told me. I hope you don't mind." A shadow passed briefly over Daniel's face at the mention of Sarah, but he shook his head. "I don't mind." "She would have wanted them to be used." He paused, then added softly, "They suit you." Mrs. Larson called them to dinner then, saving Abigail from having to formulate a response. The meal was simple but delicious: roast chicken, potatoes, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. After days of trail food, it seemed like a feast fit for royalty. As they ate, Daniel outlined his plan for the following day. "I thought we could ride into town after breakfast. I'll introduce you to Miss Winters at the school and then perhaps to Mrs. Baker at the boarding house. She keeps clean, respectable rooms for single women at reasonable rates." Abigail nodded, though the thought of leaving the safety of Daniel's ranch so soon filled her with unexpected reluctance. "That sounds sensible. We'll need to be careful," he continued. "News travels fast in these parts, and your father may have already sent word to look for you." "What will we tell people?" Abigail asked. "About who I am and why I'm here?" Daniel considered this. "The truth, more or less, that you've come to Virginia City seeking employment as a teacher. We can say you're the daughter of an old friend of my family, which explains why you're staying at my ranch temporarily." He paused, then added, "We don't need to mention your father or your situation unless it becomes necessary." It was a reasonable story, one that would explain her presence without inviting too many questions. Abigail agreed, relieved that she wouldn't need to fabricate an elaborate lie. After dinner, they returned to the parlor, where Daniel built up the fire against the cooling evening air. Mrs. Larson brought coffee before discreetly retiring to her own cabin, leaving them alone once more. "Your home is lovely," Abigail said, looking around the comfortable room. "You've built something wonderful here." "It's a work in progress," Daniel replied, settling into the chair opposite hers. "But I'm proud of it. When I first came here, there was nothing but a small cabin and a few head of cattle. Everything else I've added bit by bit." "Your family must be proud as well," Abigail ventured, curious about his background. A shadow crossed his face. "I haven't spoken to my family since I left home after Sarah's death. My father disowned me when I accused my brother-in-law of murder." "I'm sorry," Abigail said, regretting having raised what was clearly a painful subject. Daniel shook his head. "Don't be, I've made my peace with it. And I've found a new family here, Mrs. Larson and her husband, my ranch hands, friends in town." They talked late into the night, sharing stories of their lives, their hopes, their disappointments. Daniel told her about his childhood in Missouri, his journey west after Sarah's death, the struggles and triumphs of establishing his ranch. Abigail spoke of her mother's kindness, her education, her love of books and music, carefully avoiding too much mention of her father. By the time they finally retired for the night, Abigail felt as though she had known Daniel for years rather than days. There was an ease between them, a natural understanding that defied their brief acquaintance. In her comfortable bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch at night, Abigail allowed herself to acknowledge what she had been feeling since that first night around the campfire. She was falling in love with Daniel Thornton. The realization should have frightened her, coming so soon after her narrow escape from a forced marriage, but instead it filled her with a quiet joy. Whether Daniel felt the same, she couldn't be sure. But the way he looked at her sometimes, the gentleness in his voice when he spoke her name, gave her reason to hope that perhaps in time he might. Morning came with a clear sky and the sounds of the ranch already busy with the day's activities. Abigail dressed in the brown skirt and white blouse Mrs. Larson had provided, doing her best to arrange her hair in a style that would look professional and respectable for her meeting with Miss Winters. As she was pinning the last strand in place, a knock came at her door. Opening it, she found Mrs. Larson holding a small wooden box. "Good morning, Miss Montgomery. I thought you might be able to use these," the housekeeper said, offering the box. "They're just some ribbons and hairpins I've collected over the years, nothing fancy but practical." Touched by the thoughtfulness, Abigail accepted the box. "Thank you, Mrs. Larson. This is very kind of you," the older woman smiled. "It's nice having another woman in the house. Mr. Thornton is a fine employer and a good man, but he doesn't have much appreciation for the little things that make life pleasant for a lady." After selecting a simple blue ribbon that complemented her skirt, Abigail made her way downstairs to find Daniel waiting in the dining room, dressed more formally than she had yet seen him, in a clean white shirt, dark vest, and trousers. "You look very distinguished," she observed with a smile. He ran a finger self-consciously around his collar. "I don't dress up often, but I thought it appropriate for introducing you around town." They shared a hearty breakfast before setting off for Virginia City, riding side by side down the ranch road. Daniel had provided Abigail with a side saddle from his sister's belongings, allowing her to ride more comfortably and properly in a skirt. As they approached the town, Abigail felt her anxiety returning. This would be her first test meeting new people, establishing herself as someone worthy of employment and respect, all while keeping her past hidden. "Nervous?" Daniel asked, noticing her tension. "A little," she admitted. "What if Miss Winters doesn't think I'm qualified to teach?" "She will," he assured her. "You're educated, well-spoken, and clearly intelligent. The school needs someone like you." His confidence bolstered her own as they rode down the main street of Virginia City. The town was busy with morning activities, shopkeepers opening their establishments, miners heading to the diggings in the nearby gulches, women going about their marketing. They tied their horses in front of a modest building with a sign identifying it as the Virginia City School. As Daniel helped Abigail dismount, the door opened and a tall, spare woman in her 40s emerged. "Daniel Thornton," she said with a smile that warmed her rather severe features. "I didn't expect to see you in town today. I heard you were out on a cattle drive." "Got back yesterday, Miss Winters," Daniel replied, removing his hat politely. "I've brought someone I'd like you to meet. This is Miss Abigail Montgomery. She's recently arrived in Virginia City and is interested in the teaching position you mentioned was open." Miss Winters turned her assessing gaze on Abigail, who straightened her shoulders and met the older woman's eyes directly. "Miss Montgomery," Miss Winters said, offering her hand. "A pleasure to meet you. Please come inside where we can talk more comfortably." The schoolhouse was a single large room with rows of desks facing a larger desk and blackboard at the front. Windows let in ample light, and shelves along the walls held books and teaching materials. It was clean and orderly, if somewhat sparse. "Please sit down," Miss Winters invited, indicating chairs near her desk. "Now, tell me about your qualifications, Miss Montgomery." For the next half hour, Abigail answered questions about her education, her knowledge of various subjects, and her experience with children. Though she had never taught formally, she had occasionally helped younger girls with their studies at the small private school she had attended in Deer Lodge. Throughout the interview, Daniel remained silent but supportive, his presence lending Abigail confidence. When Miss Winters asked about references, he spoke up. "Miss Montgomery comes highly recommended by my aunt in Missouri, who has known her family for years," he said smoothly, the lie coming easily to his lips. "Unfortunately, there wasn't time to arrange formal letters before Abigail traveled west, but I can personally vouch for her character and abilities." Miss Winters raised an eyebrow slightly but nodded. "Well, Miss Montgomery, I must say I'm impressed with what I've heard. Our current teacher, Mrs. Collins, is leaving at the end of next week due to her husband's work taking them to Helena. The timing of your arrival is most fortunate." Hope surged in Abigail's chest. "Does that mean?" "It means the position is yours if you want it," Miss Winters confirmed with a small smile. "The pay is $30 a month, which I understand is less than you might earn in a larger city, but living costs here are reasonable." It was more money than Abigail had ever imagined earning on her own. "I accept with gratitude," she said immediately. "When would you like me to start, Mrs. Collins will finish this Friday," Miss Winters explained. "Perhaps you could come in next week to observe her methods and meet the children before taking over the following Monday. That would give you time to settle in and prepare." "That sounds perfect," Abigail agreed, hardly able to believe her good fortune. As they left the schoolhouse, Daniel grinned down at her. "Congratulations, Miss Montgomery, Virginia City's newest teacher." Abigail laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. "I can hardly believe it. I have a position, a real job, doing something worthwhile." "I told you Miss Winters would recognize your qualities," Daniel said, helping her back onto her horse. "Now, shall we visit Mrs. Baker about a room at the boarding house?" The boarding house was a neat, two-story building on a quiet street a short distance from the school. Mrs. Baker, a cheerful widow in her 50s, greeted them warmly, especially when Daniel explained that Abigail was the new schoolteacher. "Oh, how wonderful," she exclaimed. "We've been hoping Mrs. Collins's replacement would be someone suitable. The last time we needed a new teacher, they sent a young man from back east who couldn't handle the children at all. He lasted less than a month." She showed them a small but pleasant room on the second floor with a window overlooking a garden at the back of the house. "It's $8 a month, which includes breakfast and dinner," she explained. "Most of my boarders are respectable young women working in the town, 2 shop assistants, a seamstress, and now a teacher." The room was perfect, clean, comfortable, and within Abigail's new means. She agreed to take it, arranging to move in the following day. As they left the boarding house, Daniel suggested they visit the general store to purchase a few necessities for Abigail, who still had only the clothes Mrs. Larson had provided and the few items in her satchel. Though she protested that she should wait until she received her first wages, Daniel insisted. "Consider it a loan," he said firmly. "You can repay me when you're settled." The general store was well stocked with everything from clothing to household goods, tools to foodstuffs, under Mrs. Larson's guidance that morning. Abigail had made a list of items she would need, and Daniel helped her find each one, adding a few things she hadn't thought of. As they were examining bolts of fabric for a new dress, the bell over the door jangled and a well-dressed man entered. Daniel tensed beside her, his expression hardening. "Crawford," he murmured, low enough that only Abigail could hear. "Banker, owns half the businesses in town. Be careful what you say." Abigail nodded slightly, turning her back to the newcomer and pretending to be absorbed in the fabric selection. Her heart raced at the coincidence of the man's name, though he was clearly not Silas Crawford. The reminder of her narrow escape was unsettling. "Thornton," the man said, approaching them with a calculating smile. "Didn't expect to see you in town so soon after your cattle drive." "And who might this lovely lady be?" Daniel straightened to his full height, which put him several inches taller than the banker. "James Crawford, this is Miss Abigail Montgomery, Virginia City's new schoolteacher. Miss Montgomery, Mr. Crawford serves on the town council and owns the bank." Abigail turned, composing her features into a polite mask as she offered her hand. "Mr. Crawford, a pleasure to meet you." His eyes narrowed slightly as he took in her fading bruises, but his smile remained fixed. "Miss Montgomery, welcome to Virginia City. I trust you'll find our little community to your liking." "I'm sure I will," she replied evenly. "Everyone has been most welcoming." Crawford's gaze flickered between her and Daniel, a speculative gleam in his eyes. "Indeed, well, I won't keep you from your shopping. Good day to you both." He nodded and moved toward the counter, where the shopkeeper greeted him deferentially. Once they had completed their purchases and left the store, Abigail released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Is he related to Silas Crawford of Helena by any chance?" Daniel shook his head. "Not that I know of, though I wouldn't be surprised if they were cut from the same cloth. James Crawford is what passes for aristocracy in these parts, wealthy, influential, and not above using both to get what he wants." They continued their tour of the town, Daniel introducing Abigail to several other business owners and residents, all of whom greeted her warmly once they learned she was to be the new teacher. By the time they headed back to the ranch in the late afternoon, Abigail felt she had made a promising start in establishing herself in Virginia City. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of gold and purple, Abigail found herself reluctant to leave the peace of the ranch for the boarding house in town, though she knew it was the sensible course of action. "Penny for your thoughts?" Daniel asked, noticing her pensive expression. "I was just thinking how quickly everything has changed," she said. "A week ago, I was trapped in my father's house, facing a future that terrified me. Now I'm about to begin a new life I never imagined possible." She turned to look at him directly. "And it's all because of you." Daniel shook his head. "You give me too much credit. I may have helped you get away, but the courage it took to leave in the first place was all yours. And the determination to build something new for yourself, that's yours too." "Still, I owe you more than I can ever repay," Abigail insisted. "You owe me nothing," he said firmly. "If anything, helping you has been a gift to me. It's helped me lay some ghosts to rest." They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer until Mrs. Larson called them in for dinner. The evening passed pleasantly, with Daniel telling stories of his early days on the ranch that had both Abigail and Mrs. Larson laughing heartily. Later, as Abigail prepared for bed, she found herself wishing that tomorrow wouldn't come so quickly. The thought of leaving the ranch, of leaving Daniel's constant presence, filled her with an unexpected melancholy. She had known him less than a week, yet he had become more important to her than she had ever anticipated. Morning arrived with a soft rain pattering against the windows, the first precipitation since Abigail had left Deer Lodge. Mrs. Larson insisted on preparing a special breakfast for her last morning at the ranch, and the table was laden with pancakes, eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits with honey. "You're spoiling me, Mrs. Larson," Abigail protested with a smile. "Nonsense," the housekeeper replied. It's not often I get to cook for someone who appreciates it properly. Mr. Thornton would eat the same thing every day and never complain. Daniel, entering the dining room in time to hear this, laughed good-naturedly. Only because everything you cook is delicious, Mrs. Larson. After breakfast, Daniel helped Abigail load her new possessions, clothing, toiletries, a few books they had purchased the day before onto a small wagon. The rain had stopped, leaving the air fresh and clean, though clouds still hung low over the mountains. "I'll drive you into town," Daniel said, though they had already discussed this arrangement the previous evening, "and help you get settled at Mrs. Baker's." The drive to Virginia City was quiet, both of them seemingly lost in their own thoughts. Abigail watched the landscape pass by, trying to commit it to memory the way the ranch road wound through stands of aspen, the view of the mountains as they crested a particular hill, the first glimpse of the town in the valley below. Mrs. Baker welcomed them warmly, showing Abigail to her room once more and helping her arrange her belongings in the small dresser and wardrobe. When everything was settled, she tactfully withdrew, leaving Abigail and Daniel alone to say their goodbyes. "Well," Daniel said, standing somewhat awkwardly in the center of the small room. "I suppose this is it for now." Abigail nodded, suddenly finding it difficult to meet his eyes. "For now," she echoed. "I'll check on you in a few days," he promised. "Make sure you're settling in all right. And of course, you're always welcome at the ranch. Mrs. Larson would be disappointed if you didn't visit regularly." "I'd like that," Abigail said softly. He took a step toward her, then hesitated. Whatever he had been about to say was interrupted by a knock at the door. Mrs. Baker's voice called through. "Miss Montgomery, there's someone here asking for you, a Mr. James Crawford." Daniel's expression darkened. "What does he want?" Abigail shook her head, equally puzzled. "I have no idea." They exchanged a worried glance before Abigail moved to open the door. Mrs. Baker stood in the hallway, looking slightly flustered. "He's waiting in the parlor," she said. "Says it's a matter of some importance regarding your position at the school." "Thank you, Mrs. Baker. We'll be right down," Abigail replied, closing the door again and turning to Daniel. "Do you think there's a problem with my appointment?" "I don't know," Daniel said, his brow furrowed. "Crawford does sit on the town council, which oversees the school, but Miss Winters has the authority to hire teachers without their approval." They descended to the parlor together, finding James Crawford standing by the window, examining a piece of paper in his hand. He looked up as they entered, his expression unreadable. "Miss Montgomery, Mr. Thornton," he greeted them with a slight nod. "Thank you for seeing me." "Mr. Crawford," Abigail responded politely. "Mrs. Baker mentioned you wanted to discuss my teaching position." "Indeed." Crawford's gaze moved between them before settling on Abigail. "I received an interesting telegram this morning from a Judge Franklin Montgomery of Deer Lodge. He's searching for his daughter, Abigail, who has apparently run away from home." He paused, watching her reaction. "He describes her as 19 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes, with a recent injury to her face." Abigail felt the blood drain from her face, but she forced herself to remain composed. "I see," Crawford continued. "The judge is offering a substantial reward for information leading to her safe return. He's quite concerned for her welfare, it seems." "Is he?" Daniel said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Did his telegram happen to mention how Miss Montgomery received those bruises on her face?" Crawford raised an eyebrow. "So you admit this is indeed Judge Montgomery's daughter?" "We don't admit anything," Daniel stated firmly, moving to stand protectively beside Abigail. "What exactly is your interest in this matter, Crawford?" The banker smiled thinly. "My interest is in the welfare of our community, Thornton. Virginia City can't afford to become embroiled in a scandal involving our new schoolteacher. Imagine the effect on our children if their teacher is a young woman who has run away from her father's lawful authority." Abigail found her voice at last. "Mr. Crawford, I assure you that I left my father's house for good reason. I am of legal age to make my own decisions, and I have committed no crime. If the school board wishes to reconsider my appointment based on these facts, that is their right, but I hope they will judge me on my qualifications and character rather than on rumors and half-truths." Crawford studied her for a long moment. "Well spoken, Miss Montgomery. But I wonder what Judge Montgomery would say if given the opportunity to present his side of the story." "He had plenty of opportunities to tell his story with his fists," Daniel said bluntly, "on his daughter's face." A tense silence followed this statement. Crawford looked between them again, his expression calculating. "I see," he said finally. "That does put a different complexion on matters." He folded the telegram and tucked it into his vest pocket. "I will need to consult with the other council members, of course, but speaking personally, I have no wish to return a young woman to an abusive situation, regardless of reward money." Relief flooded through Abigail, though she remained wary of the banker's sudden change in position. "Thank you, Mr. Crawford," he nodded, moving toward the door. "Don't thank me yet, Miss Montgomery. While I sympathize with your situation, I must consider the reputation of our school. I will be making inquiries of my own before making a final recommendation to the council." After Crawford left, Abigail sank onto a nearby chair, her legs suddenly weak. "He knows," she whispered. "He'll tell my father where I am." Daniel knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "We don't know that," he said, though his expression was grim. "Crawford is many things, but he's not stupid. If word got out that he sent you back to an abusive father for reward money, his standing in this community would suffer." "What should we do?" Abigail asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Daniel thought for a moment. "We wait for now. See what Crawford decides to do. In the meantime, you proceed as planned, start your work at the school, establish yourself here. The more people who know and respect you, the harder it will be for anyone to force you to leave." His logic made sense, but Abigail couldn't shake the dread that had settled in her stomach. Her father's reach was longer than she had anticipated, and she had been naive to think she could escape him so easily. "I should never have involved you in this," she said miserably. "Now you're at risk too." "Abigail, look at me," Daniel said firmly, waiting until she raised her eyes to his. "I involved myself willingly, and I would do it again in a heartbeat. You are worth whatever risk might come." The conviction in his voice warmed her despite her fears. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why am I worth that to you?" Daniel's expression softened, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Because in the short time I've known you, you've shown more courage, grace, and determination than most people show in a lifetime. Because despite everything you've been through, you still find joy in simple things like wildflowers and mountain views. Because—" He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "Because I'm falling in love with you, Abigail Montgomery, and the thought of anything happening to you is unbearable to me." Abigail stared at him, stunned by the admission she had hoped for but not dared to expect so soon. "Daniel," the parlor door opened abruptly and Mrs. Baker entered, looking apologetic. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's more visitors for Miss Montgomery." "A Sheriff Daniels from Deer Lodge and 2 deputies. Daniel's face hardened as he stood. "They're here already. Crawford must have sent a telegram immediately." Fear gripped Abigail anew. "What do? We face them," Daniel said grimly. "Together, Mrs. Baker, would you ask the sheriff to wait while Miss Montgomery and I compose ourselves? And perhaps you could offer them coffee. It's been a long ride from Deer Lodge, I imagine." The landlady nodded, clearly sensing something was amiss but too discreet to ask questions. "Of course, Mr. Thornton. Take your time." When she had gone, Daniel turned back to Abigail. "Listen to me carefully. Sheriff Daniels has no legal authority to force you to return with him. You are of age and you have committed no crime. He may try to intimidate you, but stand your ground. I'll be right beside you." Abigail nodded, drawing strength from his confidence. "I won't go back," she said firmly. "No matter what they say." Daniel squeezed her hand. "That's my girl." Together they walked to the boarding house's front parlor where Sheriff Daniels and his deputies were waiting. The sheriff was a tall, lean man with a weathered face and cold eyes. He stood as they entered, his gaze immediately fixing on Abigail. "Miss Montgomery," he said, tipping his hat slightly, "your father is mighty worried about you." "I'm sure he is," Abigail replied steadily. "Though not for the reasons you might think." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. Judge Montgomery is a respected man in Deer Lodge. He says you ran off to avoid a beneficial marriage he arranged for you. Says you've always been high-spirited and rebellious. Is that what he says?" Daniel interjected coolly. "Did he also mention how she got those bruises on her face, Sheriff?" Daniels glanced at the marks, still visible though fading, then shrugged. "The judge mentioned she had an accident, fell down some stairs, I believe." "That's a lie," Abigail said firmly. "My father struck me when I refused to marry Silas Crawford, a man 30 years my senior with a reputation for cruelty to women. It wasn't the first time he had hit me, but I determined it would be the last." The sheriff looked uncomfortable but held his ground. "That's a serious accusation against a judge, Miss Montgomery, one that would be difficult to prove." "Nevertheless, it's the truth," she insisted. "Regardless," Daniels continued, "your father has asked me to escort you home, and as sheriff of Deer Lodge County, I intend to do just that." "You have no jurisdiction here, Daniels," Daniel pointed out. "This is Madison County, not Deer Lodge County. Miss Montgomery is of legal age and has committed no crime. You have no authority to compel her to go anywhere." The sheriff's expression hardened. "I may not have legal jurisdiction, Thornton, but I have a moral obligation to return a young woman to her family." "Your moral obligation should be to protect citizens from harm," Daniel countered, "not return them to those who would abuse them." A tense silence fell over the room. The two deputies exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly not having anticipated this level of resistance. "Miss Montgomery," Sheriff Daniels said finally, turning his attention back to Abigail, "I'm asking you to come peacefully. Your father is prepared to forgive this indiscretion. The marriage to Mr. Crawford can still proceed as planned." Abigail straightened her shoulders, meeting the sheriff's gaze directly. "Sheriff Daniels, I appreciate your concern, but I will not be returning to Deer Lodge. I have secured employment here in Virginia City as the new schoolteacher, and I intend to make my home here. Please convey to my father that I wish him well, but I will no longer subject myself to his control or his violence." The conviction in her voice seemed to take the sheriff aback. He looked at her for a long moment, then at Daniel, whose stance made it clear he would physically intervene if necessary. "I see," Daniel said slowly. "Well, I can't force you to come if you're determined to stay, but I should warn you, Judge Montgomery is not a man who gives up easily. He's likely to come himself once he hears you've refused to return. I'll deal with that when it happens," Abigail said with more confidence than she felt. The sheriff nodded once, then gestured to his deputies. "We'll be on our way then. Good day, Miss Montgomery, Mr. Thornton." After they had departed, Abigail sank onto a nearby chair, her legs trembling with reaction. "He's right, you know. My father won't give up that easily." Daniel knelt beside her chair once more, taking her hands in his. "Then we'll be ready for him. Abigail, I meant what I said earlier. I love you, and I will not let anyone take you back to that life." Tears filled her eyes as she looked at this man who had risked so much for her. "I love you too, Daniel. I think I have since that first night when you came to help a stranger based on nothing but a desperate note." He smiled, reaching up to gently wipe away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "Then we'll face whatever comes together." The days that followed settled into an unexpected pattern of normalcy, despite the shadow of Sheriff Daniels's warning hanging over them. Abigail began her training with Mrs. Collins at the school, quickly winning over both the children and the departing teacher with her enthusiasm and natural aptitude for teaching. Daniel rode into town daily on various pretexts, though the real reason was always to check on Abigail and escort her back to the boarding house after school. In the evenings, they often sat together in Mrs. Baker's front parlor, sometimes reading, sometimes talking, sometimes simply enjoying each other's presence in comfortable silence. On Friday afternoon, as Abigail was saying goodbye to Mrs. Collins on her last day, Miss Winters appeared at the schoolhouse with news. "The town council met this morning to discuss your appointment, Miss Montgomery," she said without preamble. "Mr. Crawford raised certain concerns about your background." Abigail's heart sank. "I see, and their decision," to her surprise, Miss Winters smiled. "They voted unanimously to confirm your appointment. It seems Mr. Crawford had a change of heart after making some inquiries. He spoke quite eloquently about the importance of judging a person on their present character rather than past circumstances. Relief washed over Abigail. That's unexpected, indeed, Miss Winters agreed. I understand Mr. Thornton may have had something to do with his change of perspective. They were seen in a rather intense discussion at the bank yesterday. Whatever Daniel had said to Crawford, it had apparently been effective. When Abigail questioned him about it that evening as they walked from the school to the boarding house, he was characteristically modest. I simply helped him see that supporting you was in everyone's best interest, he said with a slight smile, including his own. The weekend passed peacefully, with Daniel taking Abigail on a proper tour of Virginia City and the surrounding countryside. On Sunday, they attended church together, where Abigail was introduced to many of the parents whose children she would be teaching. By Monday morning, as she prepared for her first official day as Virginia City's schoolteacher, Abigail was beginning to believe that perhaps the worst was behind them, that her father might have accepted her departure and moved on. That illusion was shattered when she entered the schoolroom to find a telegram waiting on her desk. With trembling fingers, she opened it, already guessing its contents. Arriving Virginia City Wednesday stop will reclaim what is mine stop F. Montgomery. Daniel was livid when she showed him the telegram that afternoon. How dare he threaten you like this? You're not property to be reclaimed. He believes I am, Abigail said quietly. In his mind, I belong to him until he transfers that ownership to a husband of his choosing. They were sitting in the small garden behind the boarding house, the privacy allowing them to speak freely. Daniel paced back and forth, his agitation evident in every movement. We need to be prepared, he said finally, coming to sit beside her on the wooden bench. Your father will likely bring men with him, not just the sheriff, but hired guns if I know the type. What can we do? Abigail asked, fear clutching at her heart. Daniel took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. I have friends here, Abigail. Good men who won't stand by while a young woman is forced to return to an abusive situation. We'll meet your father with a show of strength that will make him think twice about trying to take you by force. The next day passed in a blur of tension and preparation. Daniel spoke with the town marshal, explaining the situation and securing his support. He also visited several ranchers and business owners he knew would stand with him, building a network of allies prepared to help protect Abigail from her father's machinations. By Tuesday evening, word had spread throughout Virginia City that Judge Montgomery of Deer Lodge was coming to retrieve his daughter against her will, and that Daniel Thornton was organizing resistance. The town, ever ready for excitement and generally suspicious of outside authority figures, largely rallied behind their new schoolteacher and the respected rancher who had championed her cause. Even James Crawford, perhaps seeing a political opportunity, publicly declared his support for Abigail's right to determine her own future. Virginia City protects its own, he was heard to say at the saloon, and Miss Montgomery is one of us now. Wednesday dawned clear and crisp, the kind of perfect autumn day that seemed at odds with the confrontation looming over them. Daniel arrived at the boarding house early, having arranged for a substitute teacher to take Abigail's classes. I don't want to hide, Abigail protested when he suggested she remain at the boarding house. I want to face him directly to show him I'm not afraid anymore. Daniel studied her face, seeing the determination that had first drawn him to her. All right, he agreed finally. But you stay by my side, no matter what happens. They spent the morning at Daniel's ranch, where Abigail found comfort in the familiar surroundings and Mrs. Larson's motherly presence. As noon approached, they rode back into town, where several of Daniel's friends were already gathered on the main street, casually positioned as if going about their daily business, though the presence of visible firearms belied their relaxed postures. The town marshal, a stocky man named Porter with a no-nonsense demeanor, approached them as they dismounted in front of the hotel. Word just came in. Montgomery's party was spotted about an hour out, should be here soon. Daniel nodded his thanks, then turned to Abigail. Are you sure you want to do this? There's still time to reconsider. I'm sure, she said firmly. I need to end this once and for all. They took up position on the hotel porch, which offered a clear view of the main street from a slightly elevated perspective. Several of Daniel's ranch hands stationed themselves nearby, while other supporters mingled with the growing crowd of curious townspeople. The wait seemed endless, though in reality it was less than an hour before a group of riders appeared at the far end of the street. At their head rode Judge Franklin Montgomery, as imposing and stern as ever in his black suit and hat. Beside him was Sheriff Daniels, and behind them rode 4 rough-looking men who were clearly hired guns rather than deputies. Daniel stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Abigail as the party drew to a halt in the center of the street. The crowd fell silent, tension thick in the air as Judge Montgomery dismounted and handed his reins to one of his men. "Abigail," he called, his voice carrying easily in the stillness. "It's time to come home." Abigail moved to stand beside Daniel, her voice steady as she replied, "This is my home now, Father." The judge's face darkened. "You are my daughter, and you will do as I say." "I have indulged your willfulness long enough." "Indulged," Daniel interjected, his tone incredulous. "Is that what you call beating her until her face was bruised and swollen? Is that what you call trying to sell her to a man 3 times her age known for abusing women?" Murmurs ran through the crowd at this, many of the townspeople glancing at Abigail's face, where the last traces of bruising were still visible if one knew to look for them. Judge Montgomery's expression hardened further. "I don't know what lies my daughter has told you, sir, but I suggest you stay out of family matters that don't concern you." "They became my concern the moment you raised your hand to her," Daniel said firmly, "and they're the concern of everyone in Virginia City now. Miss Montgomery is our schoolteacher, a respected member of our community. She stays here of her own free will, and she will not be returning with you." The judge surveyed the crowd, seemingly noticing for the first time the number of armed men positioned strategically around the street. His eyes narrowed as he turned back to Daniel. "And who exactly are you to dictate what my daughter does or doesn't do?" Before Daniel could respond, Abigail stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "His name is Daniel Thornton, Father. He is the man who saved me from a life of misery, who showed me what kindness and respect look like, who taught me that love doesn't leave bruises." She took Daniel's hand in hers. "He is the man I love and the man I intend to marry if he'll have me." Daniel's eyes widened in surprise at this public declaration, but his hand tightened around hers in silent acceptance. Judge Montgomery's face contorted with rage. "You would choose this cowboy over your own family, over the respectable marriage I arranged for you?" "In a heartbeat," Abigail replied without hesitation. "Daniel is more family to me than you have been since Mother died, and as for respectability, there is nothing respectable about selling your daughter to pay your gambling debts." Gasps and whispers rippled through the crowd at this accusation. The judge's face paled, then flushed with fury. "How dare you? You know nothing of my arrangements with Silas Crawford." "I know enough," Abigail countered. "I know he offered to forgive your substantial debts to him in exchange for my hand. I know you accepted without a moment's consideration for my happiness or welfare. I know you were willing to condemn me to the same fate that befell his previous wives." The judge took a step forward, his hand raised as if to strike her even now in front of the entire town. Instantly, a dozen weapons were drawn and aimed in his direction. Daniel moved protectively in front of Abigail, his own hand dropping to his sidearm. "I wouldn't," he said quietly, the threat clear in his voice. Judge Montgomery froze, his gaze moving from the armed townspeople to the marshal, who had stepped forward with his hand on his gun. "Judge Montgomery," Marshal Porter said firmly, "I suggest you and your men leave Virginia City now. Miss Montgomery has made her choice clear, and as she is of legal age, there is no law compelling her to return with you. Any attempt to take her by force will be met with official resistance." For a long moment, it seemed the judge might defy this directive. Then abruptly, all the fight seemed to go out of him. He straightened his shoulders, adjusting his coat with dignity that seemed at odds with the situation. "Very well," he said coldly. "If my daughter chooses to throw away everything I have worked to provide for her, so be it. But understand this, Abigail, if you make this choice, you are no longer my daughter. You will receive nothing from me, no support, no inheritance, nothing." "I understand," Abigail said calmly, "and I accept those terms gladly." The judge stared at her for another long moment, something unreadable flickering in his eyes, perhaps a glimpse of the man he had been before grief and gambling had twisted him into someone unrecognizable. Then the moment passed, and his expression hardened once more. "Sheriff, gentlemen, we are leaving," he announced, turning on his heel and marching back to his horse. The hired guns looked disappointed at the lack of confrontation but followed his lead, mounting up and falling in behind him as he rode out of town without a backward glance. As the dust settled in their wake, a cheer went up from the assembled townspeople. Daniel turned to Abigail, his expression a mixture of relief and amazement. "Did you mean it?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "About marrying me?" Abigail smiled up at him, her eyes shining with love and the liberation of finally being truly free. "Every word," she said, "if you'll have me." Daniel's answer was to gather her in his arms and kiss her, right there in front of the entire town of Virginia City. The cheers grew louder, with a few good-natured whistles thrown in for good measure. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and laughing, Daniel kept his arms around her waist. "I didn't do this properly," he murmured. "I don't even have a ring." "I don't need a ring," Abigail assured him. "I just need you." Nevertheless, he stepped back and, to her astonishment, dropped to one knee in the middle of the street. The crowd, realizing what was happening, fell silent once more. "Abigail Montgomery," Daniel said, his voice clear and confident. "From the moment I found your note, I knew you were someone special. These past weeks have only confirmed what my heart suspected from the beginning, that you are the bravest, strongest, most beautiful woman I have ever known, and that my life would be incomplete without you in it. Will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of joy filled Abigail's eyes as she nodded. "Yes, Daniel, yes, with all my heart." More cheers erupted as he rose and kissed her again, this time more briefly but no less tenderly. "Well," said Miss Winters, who had made her way through the crowd to stand beside them, "I suppose I'll need to start looking for a new teacher again." Abigail turned to her in surprise. "Oh, but I don't have to stop teaching just because I'm getting married, do I?" Miss Winters smiled. "That depends. Will you be living in town or out at Mr. Thornton's ranch?" Daniel and Abigail exchanged a glance, realizing they hadn't discussed such practical matters in their rush of emotion. "The ranch, I hope," Daniel said, looking at Abigail for confirmation. "Though we could keep a place in town if that would make things easier for your teaching." "I'd love to live at the ranch," Abigail assured him, "but I would like to continue teaching, at least until—" She blushed slightly. "Until we start a family of our own." Daniel's face softened at the mention of children. "I'd like that too," he said quietly. Miss Winters nodded decisively. "In that case, I see no reason why you couldn't continue teaching. It's a 5-mile ride from the Thornton Ranch to town, not an impossible journey, especially if Mr. Thornton is willing to bring you in each morning." "Gladly," Daniel agreed, "and I'll make sure she has the best horse on the ranch for when I can't." With that settled, the crowd began to disperse, many stopping to congratulate the newly engaged couple before returning to their daily activities. Mrs. Baker insisted they come back to the boarding house for a special dinner to celebrate, and word spread quickly through town that there would be an impromptu gathering at the hotel saloon that evening in honor of the occasion. As they walked back to the boarding house, arm in arm, Abigail felt a lightness she hadn't experienced since before her mother's death. The shadow that had hung over her for so long, her father's cruelty, the threat of forced marriage, the fear of being reclaimed had finally lifted, replaced by the bright promise of a future with the man she loved. "Are you happy?" Daniel asked softly, as if reading her thoughts. Abigail smiled up at him, her heart so full it seemed impossible to contain. Happier than I ever thought possible, she assured him. Are you? Abigail, he said, stopping to look into her eyes. The day you dropped that note at my feet was the luckiest day of my life. Everything since then has been a gift I never expected, but will treasure forever. 3 weeks later, on a crisp October day with the aspen trees glowing gold against the deep blue Montana sky, Abigail Montgomery became Abigail Thornton in a simple ceremony at the Virginia City Church. The entire town turned out for the occasion, the schoolchildren forming an honor guard outside the church, throwing flower petals as the newly married couple emerged, Mrs. Larson had outdone herself with the wedding feast, transforming the Thornton ranch house into a wonderland of autumn flowers and delicious food that had the guests talking for weeks afterward. James Crawford, now firmly established as a friend and ally, presented them with a silver tea service that Abigail suspected cost more than her annual teaching salary. When the last guest had departed and they were finally alone, Daniel led Abigail to the porch, where they stood looking out over the ranch that was now their shared home. "Happy, Mrs. Thornton?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Blissfully," she assured him, leaning back against his chest, "though I still can't quite believe it's real sometimes." "It's real," he promised, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, "and it's just the beginning." In the years that followed, the Thornton ranch prospered and grew, as did the family that called it home. Abigail continued teaching at the Virginia City School until the birth of their first child, a son they named James, after Daniel's father. 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter, Eleanor, named for Abigail's mother. As the children grew, Abigail turned her educational talents to them and to the children of the ranch workers, establishing a small schoolroom in one of the outbuildings that Daniel converted for the purpose. Her reputation as an exceptional teacher spread throughout the territory, and she occasionally wrote articles on education for the territorial newspaper. Daniel's cattle operation expanded, with innovative breeding practices and land management techniques that set a standard for other ranchers in the area. He was elected to the town council, where his fair-mindedness and integrity earned him the respect of the entire community. They never heard from Judge Montgomery again, though occasional news reached them through mutual acquaintances. He had lost his position as judge after a scandal involving bribery, and his gambling habits had eventually cost him most of his property. Silas Crawford had died in a suspicious accident at his Helena estate, leading to whispers that perhaps one of his servants had finally taken revenge for years of mistreatment. Abigail found she could think of her father with pity rather than fear or anger, now a sad, lonely old man who had lost everything that truly mattered in his pursuit of wealth and power. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Daniel surprised Abigail with a small silver locket containing miniature portraits of their children. Inside the lid, he had inscribed the words that had changed both their lives forever. "You're safe now." "I am," Abigail agreed, tears of happiness in her eyes as she fastened the locket around her neck. "Safe and loved and more blessed than I ever dreamed possible." Daniel gathered her in his arms, marveling as he often did at the journey that had brought them together, a desperate note, a midnight escape, a love that had grown from the seeds of compassion and courage into something strong enough to withstand any challenge. "I love you, Abigail Thornton," he whispered against her hair. "Today, tomorrow, and for all the days to come, and I love you," she replied, raising her face for his kiss. "My hero, my heart, my home." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in hues of gold and purple, they stood together on the porch of the home they had built, surrounded by the evidence of their shared dreams and hard work. The future stretched before them, bright with promise and secure in the knowledge that whatever it might hold, they would face it together, two souls who had found in each other not just safety, but the truest meaning of home.